We got 2 hours scheduled, and I think we should be able to get through the rest of the ordinance. And so I'll share my screen. We're going to start in the mixed use commercial section, and we'll go through. If you have questions, go ahead and say something, and I'll try and stop and ask every once in a while. So now sharing my screen. Of course, I have to have it. Here we go. We last looked at this table of dimensional standards. We're moving on. The next change in the ordinance is not a policy change. It's just a change, a little bit of language and a little bit of rearranging structure-wise. You can see that instead of listing out single and multifamily dwellings, we just say existing dwellings because there's a lot of different kinds in the R1 section now. And then lodging on the first floor is a conditional use. That is in there right now as a conditional use. This is the downtown waterfront district conditional uses. And then we are renumbering here where we refer to the dimensional standards when we talk about the downtown stuff. And then we get to the MU, commercial residential misuse district. There's quite a few changes included in the ordinance here. I would consider most of them restructuring, but some of them you could also consider policy changes, so we'll look at them. Of course, this purpose statement is just a typographical error being fixed. We look at the permitted principal uses, and you can see the underlying used to say single family and multifamily at 2 to 4 units, and now we have the exact same list here that is also proposed to be included in the R1 zone. So you could potentially have more than 4 units as a permitted use in the mixed use district. And the uses by conditional use, then we had multifamily 5 to 10 units as conditional. Now that's just up here included in the permitted principal uses. And then we'll just move on, I guess, to the CI Service Commercial Industrial District. Again, we had the same language, single and multifamily dwellings included in our conditional uses. And we're getting rid of single and multifamily because we have such a differing list now in the R1 zone. That's not helpful. So it just says existing dwellings as regulated in R1 residential district. And then one family dwellings down here. So that this is improvements to existing dwellings, and this is new one family dwellings. This really isn't a change in what it says in the CI Service Commercial Industrial District, but because this refers back to rules in the residential, it could potentially allow things. I can't think of any existing residential in here that are some of the new uses, but there could be some out there. Does anybody have any questions about this list in mixed use or this change in CI? Okay. Renumbering again with this 1913A. This is just, we haven't, every time we say 1913 somewhere in the ordinance, we have to change it to A here. So it's going to happen a number of times. A couple of changes here. Again, typographical errors in the BDA zone. Nothing to do with any of the housing stuff, but we're just fixing it up while we're making this change to the zoning ordinance.
Right. And Mike, on the BDA zone, like, just to be clear, we're not talking about any kind of changes to the BDA, how the BDA is being utilized at this point. Like, this point is basically to do the work of establishing like a clarified and simplified zoning ordinance, not to actually change the rules of the BDA.
There's nothing in there that's changing rules of the BDA, but Jeff went through a pretty thoroughly look at our zoning ordinance to try and figure out all the places where there were references to things that got changed or language that was related to the changes we talked about. And just as a part of that process, he found some typographical errors that we were changing at the same time. And if it wasn't Jeff, it was Chris. Back to the ordinance. Now, section 16 of the ordinance is talking about making some significant restructuring of sections. So we've got this new section called use-specific standards. We had some things that we call performance standards that were separated out in a section like this in the ordinance, but we also had some that were included in specific zones. And now we have them all relocated to this place. And sometimes they're moved around a little bit. So these hotel and motel standards are all being deleted here. We'll see again, though, so the first use specific standard we have is just a typographical change on bed and breakfast homes, but you can see none of the language about bed and breakfast is being changed. Government building use specific standards is getting moved out of here. Self-service laundromat is staying right now. These signs are getting moved out. Again, the church lighting is okay, but the signs are getting moved out. We have a section of the ordinance that deals with signs, and so all these use-specific standards that we're talking about signs are going to just get moved to that section, which we'll see later on. Manufactured homes was in a different place in the ordinance, but we're now just talking about in very simplified terms. The use-specific standard that we have for manufactured homes is they have to be built in conformity with the manufactured home building code. There was some conversation about this because we don't enforce the building code, and so whether or not to refer to this in the ordinance was a question that was discussed. I'm not sure that we have the ability to enforce this because we don't know really, we don't have the expertise to know what it means. But it's something that has to be done anyway. So whether or not we put it in the ordinance. Jeff, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, it's just that is the requirement that the state has, is that manufactured homes have to comply with that. So yeah, whether you have to or not, I guess that's for the attorney to decide. That's how I'd look at it.
Okay. But we at least know what the ordinance is saying there. It's pretty simple. I'll go back to it. Now we get into some of the new uses that we've listed, and there are some use-specific standards for them. So the attached row house or townhouse dwelling. This is a new use, and we do have a couple of specific requirements for it. Each dwelling with street frontage shall have a principal entrance facing the front property line and street. So that's just one way to know that this is indeed a row house, townhouse dwelling. And access to off-street parking shall be from an alley. So this question here, when we talked about what's the purpose of a setback and side yard setbacks and rear yard setbacks, we talked a little bit about, well, these uses, particularly ones with multiple dwellings, but also ones that have smaller lots, need to be able to plan for off-street parking and dumpsters potentially and other utilities potentially. And one of the things we thought was that would be difficult to do row house or townhouse dwellings where they had to have a driveway from the front to get to the back and still keep a 10-foot side yard setback. And it might make more sense for these to have all the garages in the backyard and to have the access to the off-street parking be from an alley. So this means that in order for someone to build a row house or a townhouse, there has to actually be a developed alley on a block that they would do that.
Mike, then may I have the question? Currently, the city does not maintain the alleys. Would that then become something that we would do? And if we do for one, would we then do for all?
So we don't maintain alleys very often. We do when there's a lot of snow. Sometimes we will get involved in breaking through the piles at the end. But most of the alley maintenance that occurs in the city is done by private contractors on behalf of property owners that are using those alleys, because it's pretty spotty where alleys are being used and aren't. So then the question you're asking, Kelly, is maybe if people start using alleys a lot more, will we start maintaining them? And I think the answer is we can always ask ourselves that question, and a council can always decide that it's time to start doing that or that they don't want to do that. So if I think about a situation right now, and we'll go back to the Marais condos because I think it's kind of a good case test. They have a developed alley. It's actually paved for about 2/3 of the block or 3/4 of the block that's used to access off-street parking for their multifamily dwelling. And the city does not maintain it by plowing it. As a matter of fact, we didn't pave it either. They paved it, and they just repaved it, and we did not participate financially in that project as well. So there is a way for a private multifamily development to use an alley without the city deciding to do maintenance on it. But I do think it's a fair question for us to think about. If a lot more alleys are going to be constructed, do we want to start getting involved in it? And then if we do we need construction standards? Are we going to do assessments? Who's going to do maintenance? How is that all going to happen? And I don't think that's something that we have to know right now, but it is a good question to think about.
Can I ask a question? Oh, go ahead, Kelly.
With the wording there, that's our rule that they have to use it. So then I wonder if they come back to us, that's just something to think about. Are they going to come back to us and say, your rule is this, so why aren't you maintaining it, or we want you to maintain? I can see where that could pop up. So I just wonder, obviously a discussion for another day, but I just wonder how, or if any wording needs to be there, or if Jeff has come across that in other cities that he's worked for.
Let's see. I would say that other cities that we've worked with, row houses are on blocks with alleys typically. I mean, to have them, the housing type that you're trying to get is a housing type that's oriented to the street like a one family house. And so it's more compatible with the one family homes on that block if it's also facing the street. So the alley it's important. I mean, whether it's public or private, like Mike said, I don't think that's critical, but a lot of your blocks do have alleys platted already, and they're owned by the city. They're public land, so they can be public. That's not a problem. But yeah, the question is the city, what's involved with the city upgrading them and maintaining them, I guess. But I don't think the housing type, as we discussed it in the planning commission, is probably less desirable if there is not an alley access, because then you have, if you're in the middle row house, you don't have access to a parking space. So, unless you build a tuck under with driveway side by side along that street, which is probably not what you would desire in a single family neighborhood.
Yeah, particularly with 18-foot wide lot, you don't want to have, it'd be basically a continuous driveway if you had 18-foot lots of row houses with front driveways. Anton.
Yeah, my question just was, maybe it was just how it was read, but when you say existing alleys, does that mean like they have to be constructed and built out, or just like platted alleys? Like if somebody was going to develop a piece that didn't have the gravel down yet, right? It was just what Is that right? Like how that was read, that it needs to be an existing alley, and like by existing, do they mean like it's in its, usable state, or just platted?
And it doesn't specify. It says from an alley is
Okay.
what the ordinance says. So that could mean a private easement in the back that's functioning as an alley, or it could be a public right-of-way that private improvements have been made on in the alley, or it could be a publicly constructed and maintained alley. Any of those things would work.
Okay. All right. I'm just making sure.
All right, let's jump back in and see what else we can come up with. The next use that we add use-specific standards for is large apartment dwelling. So first we say the exterior waste and recycling facilities shall be located in the rear yard and screened with a fence. I think the thought here was a small apartment dwelling could still act a lot like a duplex or a triplex where everybody's taking care of their own garbage and it's not an issue. But once you get to a larger development, we need to start requiring folks to plan for this for the entire facility. And we don't want to see everybody's garbage cans out in random places. So this is just an issue that was taken care of. Surface parking shall be screened from adjacent residential lots with landscaping or fencing. We're not too concerned about what that looks like, just that they'd have a plan to do some screening. And then a building that's more than 50 feet in width should be divided in increments. And then you've got this list here. This language is actually from existing downtown standards that we have, where we talk about new buildings that are more than 50 feet width. And this is the idea that we don't want a building to show up in the middle of any of our neighborhoods, whether they're commercial or residential, that's just got a big blank wall facing the public spaces. That there needs to be some architectural means to break it up, just as a way to keep it at human scale. Moving on to cottage courtyard development. There's some requirements here. First of all, the dwellings have to be 10 feet from each other. There needs to be a shared courtyard, which is centrally located, allowing each dwelling to be located adjacent to the shared courtyard. So now it's just trying to add some definition with some specificity to what we mean when we say cottage courtyard development. And the shared courtyard needs to be at least 20 by 20 feet. So that's not very big, but it's big enough to be just kind of a shared entryway for people. Each dwelling with street frontage shall have a principal entrance facing the front property line and street. And then each dwelling that does not have street frontage shall have a principal entrance facing the shared courtyard. And again, this is to try and keep as much oriented towards the street as possible so that there is some kind of human scale and it fits in with the surrounding neighborhoods. Pedestrian paths are provided to ensure pedestrian access from each individual dwelling to the front property line and street. All parking shall be provided in a shared parking area in the rear that accommodates a minimum of one off-street parking space per dwelling.
So Mike, I have a question about the cottage courtyard development concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that this is one of the things that's kind of it's a new density tool for making sure that you can build homes in a tight pack and get them, get things built like in a little self-contained neighborhood kind of thing. Is there anything? What was in our ordinance before that prevented that from occurring? Was it the density? Was it like having the central courtyard? Was it the access, or was it all of the above? Because I think that's a really great idea, and for some of the properties that are available in Grand Marais, it seems like it would be a really applicable tool to use. But it seems like, what does the current ordinance, not the amended ordinance, does the current ordinance have things in the way of allowing that to happen?
Yeah, so let's unpack a bit. How do we deal with existing requests to build multiple structures on a property? The current ordinance has a regulation that we already looked at that said multiple dwellings can be built on an existing property if each dwelling meets the requirements of that zoning district as if it were on its own property. So if you're going to build 3 single-family homes on one lot, each of them have to meet our 75-foot frontage width. Each of them have to meet our setback requirements. Each of them have to meet our required area. So there's really no way to do a cottage courtyard with the existing rules to build multiple dwellings. The other way that this happens is like accessory dwellings on a property. So there are some where there's an old, maybe an old cabin development that's been over the years improved to have a couple of rental properties on it. And you couldn't build something like that today with existing rules, but you could improve it and maintain it with existing rules. And then finally, there's in the mixed use zone, we don't have minimum lot size or setback requirements because it used to be the C1 zone, which doesn't have minimum lot size and setback requirements. So you could potentially build this right now in the mixed use zone if it was a certain number of units. I think it was 2 to 4 we looked at. Does that answer your question, Jay? Okay.
Yeah, it does. That's kind of what I assumed. I just it's good to hear you put it in the whole context. So thank you for that.
And when I think about where something like this currently exists in town, there's not a great example anywhere of a cottage courtyard development, but there is a couple examples of multiple small dwelling units on a shared, like one owner piece of property that are often kind of what I described earlier. They used to be a cabins or a resort that was built a long time ago before we had zoning requirements, and now they're all being rented out separately. And there's a handful of those around town, but there aren't any of them really that are oriented the way that this is describing. So this is something that I think would be a little bit new, as opposed to some of the other uses on the list.
Well, and this kind of solves that problem too with the platted subdivision, where you have to have that minimum acreage size in order to kind of do some of the similar things you're able to do in the cottage courtyard development, right? That, you can define what your setbacks are, you can define all those different things, but it's hard to find that amount of property, let alone enough to set aside to public space, right? So this kind of helps fill that gap, right?
You're talking about comparing this to a planned unit development.
That's
think.
what I'm, planned unit development.
So the planned unit development does end up with a subdivision where you've got separate lots that you're selling. And the cottage courtyard development does not anticipate selling separate lots. The minimum lot size when you're talking about the cottage courtyard development is for the entire property,
right,
that all the cottages are on. So I think that's where it's a little bit different than a planned unit development.
Okay.
And just to add to that, those units still could be owned. They could be condo units. So even though they're on one lot, each person could own their unit. Or they could be rental, just like a house could be rental.
Gotcha.
Okay, back to the ordinance. Manufactured home park development. So this language both existed in a different place and it's being moved here and is also being slightly modified. So first of all, it says a minimum of 500 square feet per mobile home shall be provided for play area. That's all stuff that came from before. Setback requirements. You can see that's 20 feet or the sum of the heights of the 2 units, whichever is greater. When it abuts a single family residential use area, there's a minimum side setback of 50 feet. Now that is all stuff that we've got right now. General internal park development requirements. There shall be a minimum front yard setback of 15 feet. The home stand is at an elevation, distance, and angle relative to the street and driveway. I'm not going to read all this. This stuff all exists in our existing ordinance, got cut and pasted. So if anybody wants to go through any of this, let me know. I'm skipping through the internal private street requirements for the same reason, and the registration for the same reason. And then the maintenance is the last section. So all that's cut and paste from an existing place in our ordinance. But something that didn't come with it was there was a requirement for the minimum size to be 5 acres, and there be a minimum of 5,000 square feet per unit. And that's gone now. And instead, we go back to this table. You can see the manufactured home park. It has to be at least 3 units, and the minimum size is 10,000 feet if it's connected to municipal sewer, or 1.6 acres if it's not, at least 100-foot width lot, or 200 if it's not, and no more than 50-foot lot coverage. So you have to then meet all of these dimensional requirements for the internal private streets, all of the internal park development requirements, all of the open space and setback requirements. And if you can do that on a 10,000 square foot lot, you could potentially ask for permission to build one of these. That we haven't changed that these are going to be conditional uses in any of the zones that they're still allowed to be in. So I know that this was something that came up at our last meeting, so I'll just pause right here and ask questions.
Now, Mike, so you said that that a lot of that language, or all of that language, was cut and pasted from a previous part, or a different part of the ordinance. So is that was that, when that was originally written and put in the ordinance, was that based then on the mobile home standards, that, because the state has mobile home standard, like mobile home park standards as well? Is that where we got that information, or is that something that we just made up? I suppose that's a hard question to answer. Just wondering where we got all of those numbers and all those setbacks, and the 50% lot coverage, I think makes sense. Anything more than that seems like you're really starting to cram stuff in there. And maybe Jeff can speak to that a little bit as well. But we've kind of blasted through a bunch of that info, and it would be nice to know what considerations went into creating those pieces of information in the first place.
So I'm positive we borrowed it from somewhere. It's probably existing state regulations that we just cut and pasted into our ordinance. I couldn't tell you when. It could very well have been 1971 when the original ordinance was passed. And one of the things that we're changing is what we name it. It's not mobile home parks anymore, but manufactured home parks. So I think that's part of updating to be consistent with existing state regulations. Other than that, we haven't changed any of the language that's in there. I frankly don't think there's likely going to be a lot of demand for new mobile home parks being built in our R1 zones. So I'm not too worried about what those regulations say, or having to go back and change them. But I think it is important to point out that we're changing the density and minimum lot size requirements for this use, just like we're doing for all the other residential uses in this ordinance. And right now it's slotted in there as kind of the same as any of our other large multifamily uses. And then it's hard to, unless you actually went through an exercise where you tried to draw out how a development would be laid out on a piece of property, it's hard to describe. But the idea that you could really do it on 10,000 square feet seems pretty ridiculous. I mean, you'd have a pretty limited number of units on it. Tim?
Yeah, and I think, keeping that as a conditional use, makes so much sense because of all the possibilities and types of development that could occur, that could be classified as a manufactured home park. And again, this kind of goes back to my statements earlier about, the large and small apartment units and the cottage courtyard, and row house development also being considered as a conditional use, just because of the varieties of types of development that could occur. I mean, it's easy to visualize something that could fit, but it's also easy to visualize something that might not be appropriate and compatible with the surrounding homes in a neighborhood. And that's why I've kind of raised that question, in the last, couple meetings about whether we should be thinking about these other larger scale uses as conditional. I know when we started out with this project, we wanted to remove barriers to housing that were creating problems for people. But I don't think it was the intent to eliminate the public oversight that we should necessarily take, especially on larger projects that might have a significant impact. So, I mean, as much as I think it's good to remove barriers and will be helpful in expanding the housing stock in our community, I also am concerned about how larger scale projects fit, and if they're just allowed to be developed under these standards. I think there are situations where I think they would be viewed by a lot of people in the community as being not compatible with the existing neighborhood. So throw that out there again for just our thoughts and considerations.
And I look forward to you making that motion when this is on the agenda at a council meeting and having a little more discussion and voting on it.
If I could just add to the conversation about manufactured homes. So we have looked at manufactured home ordinances across quite a few cities for a previous project, and then for this one, and they can vary quite a lot. Some cities have many pages of regulations for manufactured homes, home parks, and some cities have surprisingly few standards for them. So the language in your code, I don't know where it came from specifically, but I can tell it's pretty familiar. So I'm sure it did come from, a model ordinance, 30 years ago or something. But the intent of this project was not to really change the manufactured regulations very much. We got rid of a few things that just really made no sense. And one of them was that 5 acre minimum, just because that 5 acres is 2 blocks in Grand Marais. So, I mean, just the scale of making any manufactured home have to be 2 blocks in size didn't seem to make sense. And we did see that as a barrier to housing. But the other ones, we could identify those, but we just felt like they were meaningless. But that was it. The rest of it we kind of left intact because the focus wasn't on changing manufactured home parks very much.
Let's skip ahead. To the ADU, another one that I know we were all looking forward to. This one, I think, as Anton, you mentioned maybe last meeting, is something that could potentially see some development with this new rule. So first off, just some context. I think there's a lot of existing things out there that will qualify as an ADU. And we've had folks take a lot of different legal pathways through our existing ordinance to try and build something that's an ADU. A pretty common version is to plumb a garage in and then there's an apartment in it, or a second floor above an apartment, or there's an existing shed in the back that ends up being connected to the utilities of the house and we never even know about it. Or again, back to the idea of old cabin developments where they're all connected to utilities, but there's one main house and the other ones are being rented out on the property. So we've had a lot of these existing, but the pathway to build one has never been clear. Our ordinance has never done a good job of defining what it is, where we want them, what the requirements are to have them. And so now we're doing that. So that we're first saying they have to comply with all the requirements for accessory buildings. And if we need to go back and look at that, we can. But here's the exceptions. They have to be located in the rear yard of the lot. Now, the way we define that means behind the structure. So not the last 25 feet, a rear yard setback, but wherever the structure gets built, it has to be behind it on the street side or on the opposite of the street side to be considered the rear yard of the lot. And if you're in a corner lot, now this definition isn't going to help, so we're going to have to look at a different place. A detached ADU shall have a minimum of 5-foot side and rear yard setbacks. When we refer to this section 19.14 subdivision 3, it allows accessory units that are not ADUs to be as close as 2.5 feet to the rear and side yard setbacks if they're under 12 feet in height. And a detached ADU shall have a maximum building height of 20 feet or the height of the principal dwelling, whichever is less. Next, the minimum distance between a detached ADU and any other building on the same lot is 5 feet. That's an existing requirement in our ordinance that buildings are at least 5 feet away from each other. The maximum size of an ADU may not exceed the total square footage of the principal dwelling or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. So if this principal dwelling is 5,000 square feet, you can only have 1,000 square foot sized ADU. So the conversation around this really was trying to figure out, what do we mean by accessory, and when does it become not accessory? And when somebody builds one dwelling and then they want to build another one, but the first one was the principal, and then they build a second one that's bigger, and then the first one becomes the accessory. How are we going to sort all that out? And we decided, as long as it's always clear what the primary or the principal dwelling is, and the whatever else can meet these requirements of the ADU, then it doesn't really matter. For an ADU that's incorporated into a detached garage, the garage square foot shall not be included in this calculation. So for instance, where we've got, and I can think of an example of both ways in town, either a detached garage that has an apartment and it's all on one floor and they're just one half is garage, one half is apartment, or a detached garage where it's got garage on the main floor, the ground level, and then it is an upstairs apartment. We'll only look at the square footage of the area being used as a dwelling to do this calculation. One off-street parking space per ADU shall be provided in addition to the off-street parking required for the principal. A separate outside entrance is necessary for an attached or an internal ADU, and it's located on the side or rear of the principal building. An existing accessory structure may not be converted if the above requirements are not met. Most existing structures that are kind of accessory looking, I think, will meet those requirements. But if you've got a 2,000 square foot pole barn garage on your dwelling, you can't convert it to a dwelling and call it an ADU. You'll have to take another pathway if you want to do that. More than one. Okay, I'll stop.
Oops, sorry. What happens if the garage itself is bigger than the primary dwelling and you want to put an apartment on top? Does that then have, and I can think of it, I think actually our house, the garage square footage might be just a little more than our house almost. So if we were to put an apartment on top, would we not be able to put a full floor covering the whole thing?
Well, it depends. So let's talk two scenarios. If your house is less than 1,000 square feet, then and the garage was in front of where the house was, and this, I know this isn't how it's arranged on your lot, but then you could potentially build a larger apartment on the garage and it becomes the principal building, and the existing house, if it's in the rear yard and under 1,000 square feet and less than 20 feet in height and not closer than 5 feet to the lot line and all the requirements, right? Then it becomes the ADU and the new one becomes the primary. In your case, you'd have to keep the house as the primary because it's oriented in a way that would make it that all the time. And yes, the garage apartment could not be more than 1,000 square feet or bigger than the house, whichever. If so, the house is smaller than 1,000 square feet, then the garage apartment could not be bigger than what the house is.
Square footage would just be our main floor, right? We're not counting, like a lot of us I can think have basements that aren't real great. You know, many houses in this town were built long ago. So we're talking just like main floor square footage if there were an upstairs, not necessarily that basement.
That is a gray area at times for us, so I'm just going to zip through our definitions and make sure that we're using the right words here.
I just often think of what is real living space versus what is something that we've used or whatever. I mean, I can think Anton's old house. I don't know if you ever fixed up the basement or not, but that must have had a very old basement where you had square footage on your main floor and an upstairs to it. But I don't know that you count in basement square footage really.
I know the county didn't include the basement as finished square footage as far as the size, on the tax roll.
Yeah.
So we've generally used the footprint of the building rather than the floor area of the building when we talk about square footage. So that's how I would have normally interpreted it. But I'll also say our ordinance isn't super clear about that. And a person could make an argument that all of the floor area of a structure should be counted. And I don't know that we could clearly point out where our ordinance says that's not right. So that might be something we want to keep on our list and have the planning commission look at.
Can I, maybe I missed my chance on this, but when you were going through the first part of the ADUs, you made the comment that on corner lots, that's something different and we don't have an answer. What is it? Should we come up with an answer? Not maybe us right now, but it seems like we should come up with an answer, right?
Let's finish looking at all the ADU requirements and then come back to that.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. Great.
So, more than one ADU is allowed on the same lot if the above requirements are met. So this was one of the questions that came up last time was, how many ADUs could you possibly build on a lot? And the answer is we don't limit it as long as all of them meet all of the requirements in the ordinance, in the R1 requirements and all of these separate requirements up here. And the fact that they're ADUs means you couldn't condo them and sell them separately. Then they're clearly not accessory anymore. So this is something that a person has to be willing to continue to operate a principal dwelling on the property and then rent out the accessories dwellings as well. And then here it just makes that even more clear. They shall not be sold independently of the principal residential dwelling and not be a separate tax parcel. So now back to your question, Anton. Right now we say a detached ADU shall be located in the rear yard of the lot. But on a corner lot, we don't define it with rear yard. We've got two fronts and two sides. So if we want to allow ADUs in the rear, or what we would consider a rear yard on a corner lot, I think it's going to take some thought on how that would work.
Yeah, I mean, that's okay.
This is something that I think would be really good for us to try to figure out and define, because this was one of our problems when we were talking now about zoning and people having campers in their front yards, side yards, trying to determine those things. That was a sticking point. That's where we stopped and never continued and figured that out. So I think that we have some work to do in defining these things so that we can clearly allow people to develop or to have campers, trailers, whatever, and make it understandable for us, for the public, and for the sheriff's department.
I agree. Corner lots are tough.
I think of the one that's by me. Oops, Mike's muted. I'm sorry.
I was zipping in and looking at the definitions that we're amending and just making sure we didn't actually include one already on this ordinance, and we haven't. But we've talked about potentially adding some amendment that talks about corner side also being considered a rear yard. So that would kind of just take care of the issue, at least in terms of clarity and allowing people to do things that are allowed in the ordinance. But when we think about what's the purpose of saying we want ADUs in the rear yard in the first place, it's kind of to keep them out of sight, and that's one of the ways that they're accessory, is that they're not the visible structure on a property. And when you've got a corner lot, it's difficult to put something in a place where it's not visible. There generally isn't a place like that that's just behind the house. So I think before we made that change, and it's really the same issue with the trailers and everything else, before we would make a change like that, we need to look at, well, what if we allow ADUs in side yards on corner lots? Here's how they might be oriented. Does that still make sense to people? So this is a good first step, I think. And it's easy enough for us to go back and make the simple change of modifying the definition of rear yard to include side yards on corners later on. If we want that to be an allowed use, we wouldn't have to change anything else about accessory dwelling units. Okay, back to the ordinance. It's not quite where we left it though, so I'm gonna have to.
I got a quick question for Jeff.
Shoot.
When laying this out, I'm looking at like some of these distances of 10 feet between buildings, 5 feet between from back lot setbacks. Did you guys ever take a look at what propane companies require for space when setting tanks? I know we've got some problems downtown already with some gallonage issues. Too many tanks in one spot, too close to buildings. I know that there are setbacks for tanks from like 125 gallons to 500, then 500 to 1,000 or 2,000 require more space. I'm just wondering, I'm just making sure that we accommodate that in this ordinance, so we don't squeeze that out. Because we don't have natural gas up here, and if they don't use electric, they're gonna obviously use propane. And those tanks have,
Actually, we're in the business of selling electricity to people, and know that it works very well up here. So the ordinance doesn't require people to have room for propane tanks. It allows them to not have room for propane tanks and come up with alternate sources of heat. But if they do want to use propane tanks, then they'll have to find a way to, whatever they're building, make sure it also meets the rules for the propane tank providers. That's not something that we're experts on here. So when somebody comes in with an application for us about building things, we don't have an ability to evaluate whether they've met the propane provider's requirements. But I do know that the propane companies have been pretty stringent and strict about that recently. And if somebody's building a new structure, they're not just going to get a propane tank located there if they're not meeting the requirements. So it's not in our ordinance to guarantee that there's room for propane tanks, but we do allow folks to have alternative energy sources.
yeah, I understand that, but I also understand we could be creating problems when we have 5 foot, 10 foot setbacks. That's all I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think
Do a cottage, if you do like this one's, if you do what was that, 10 feet between buildings, you have to have 10 feet for 100. I think you got to have 10 feet for a 125 gallon tank.
and
So-
a 500 too. It's 10
And
feet from
up to 500, yeah.
up
Then
to,
to go bigger than that, you need 25 feet. But then if they have an air conditioner hanging out the back of their house, you got to stay 10 feet from that, even if you have a smaller tank. So they look at that as an ignition source. So there are some, potential problems with some of the wording and what we're doing here. That's all. So when you start densifying dwellings, we either their choice is going to have to be electricity. It's not going to be propane. And I think a lot of times when you do these things like this, you don't have to worry about energy sources because most towns have natural gas and they just plumb it in and everybody gets, heat. But we have a little different scenario up here. So I was just concerned about that. That's all.
Yeah, I think, this is Jeff. I think you could add specific setbacks for propane tanks, I guess, in the same way that you would do it for a wind turbine. That's been a hot, popular topic in recent years. If somebody wants to have an individual, a wind unit on their property, those come with specific setbacks, as do, any of the communication facilities, towers, that sort of thing. So, those do exist in ordinances. Whether you want to do that related to housing, I guess that's up to you, but there are precedents for doing that sort of utilities specific setbacks.
Yeah, I'm not advocating that we have specific setbacks for propane tanks. What I am advocating is that we realize that that can be a heat source. And if we have a zoning ordinance that obviously makes it impossible to use propane, then I think we're ignoring a potential issue on some of these potential buildings or developments that we might see.
I can
Unless-
see it being a barrier.
What's that?
I'm sorry, Craig. I said, I can see it being a barrier. One of the houses that Patrick had in the pictures that he gave us when we were looking at things for zoning, it actually is a family member's. And right next to them, from their door to the next person's door is probably 15 feet. And in between, there's a propane tank, which belongs to the neighbor. It's not theirs. They heat with fuel oil, which is in the basement. If they ever wanted to convert, I don't know where they'd put a propane tank on their lot, because they have a deck on the back. They have probably 20 feet to the curb, if that. They certainly don't want it in their front yard, and they have no parking. Their parking is on the street. So I see where it can be a bit of a barrier. That's why I had asked the question before about that, because propane is economical. A lot of people, I know, I prefer cooking with gas than using an electric cooktop. So yeah, I'm curious about that one too. I have a little worry if we've got propane tanks in a small condensed area, that there's an issue of safety.
Well, because the insurance issue, the homeowner won't be able to get insurance. So that's how it works if you don't have space for it.
So
Yeah.
right now,
Move on.
we have multiple zones where we don't require any setbacks at all. We allow 100% lot coverage, and this is already an issue. And our strategy is not to get involved in solving it. Like, we don't have the expertise to make sure that people plan accordingly, and we leave it to the propane providers to do that. And they do have the expertise. They do know what the rules are. And if we're concerned about this being an issue in these new zones, it's already an issue. We know that it's already an issue, right? We've already talked about and dealt with some of the issues associated with the downtown, where we've got not only very little setbacks, but also very large propane tanks at the same time. So I think that the best we can do here is to give people options on what energy source they're going to use, and let people work it out on their properties, what's actually going to fit and what's not. And if they try to use as much of the space as the zoning ordinance allows, that might mean they're not going to be able to have a propane tank. Okay, let's move on. Hotels and commercial districts. This is a cut and paste. So this is something that we have separately, and that we're just moving into this use specific standard zone here. None of this is being changed. Hotel in RCN district, same thing. This is cut and paste. Automobile service stations in Highway 61 zone corridor. This is also a cut and paste. If anybody's curious about any of those, we can jump in and talk about them. This is our existing tabulation of district provisions, except now we add the term non-residential to the title because we've removed all of the residential zones from this list. This is good because our existing table is quite a bit wider than this with a couple more columns in it, and it doesn't fit on a page very well. So now it does. We haven't changed any of these district provisions or dimensional requirements.
Hey, Mike. Sorry to jump you off that. Can you go back up to the auto repair thing? I just had more of a question of, since construction is kind of down on that one side of town, what does it say about like parking and overflow parking and such? Does it say anything about that? I guess I could go and read the old one too, but.
H61 corridor, first of all.
Okay, go ahead.
So the general requirement is the lot has to be 100 feet wide. Gas pumps have to be at least 25 feet away. There has to be a site plan that talks about where all this stuff's going to be. No repairs shall be offered to customers for all that stuff. This is existing language. Automobile service stations means gas stations basically here.
Gotcha.
So when we're talking about places where mechanical work is being done, I think we have a different name for that.
Okay. Sorry.
And I'll take a look and show you what it says about those other things. But yeah, well, it's probably not related to this conversation, so we'll keep going. This we talked about a little bit earlier. This is the language, Jay, that you were asking about. What about building cottage courtyards with the existing rules? In any district, more than one structure housing a permitted use may be erected, provided the requirements of this chapter met for each structure, as though we're on an individual lot. Well, that's not very... why would you do it on the same lot then? You might as well divide it up. So subdivision 2 goes away, and this now becomes subdivision 2. This is the accessory building rules that we referred to when we talked about ADUs. So all these apply to ADUs. It has to be no closer than 5 feet if it's detached. It has to be structurally a part of the building if it's attached. Can't be located in any front yard, except where such front yard lies between the building and the shoreline, in which case such arrangement may be permitted. That's pretty specific, and I can't think of any circumstances where that happens in the city. We say accessory buildings not more than 1 story and 12 feet. This is different now, right? For an ADU, we'll allow it to be more than 1 story if it's above, say, a garage, and it can be up to 20 feet in height. We also say that it cannot occupy more than 30% of the area of any side or rear yard, and that it can only be 2.5 feet from the side. So we deviate from that on ADUs and say they have to be 5 feet away from the side or rear lot line. And a little bit of decks not related. Signs are in this ordinance because, well, we're renumbering, first of all. We're changing the name here of signs permitted in the residential district. So you can see we're jumping right away to 6 in the signs. We skipped all the commercial sign language. This is basically what's allowed in the residential district. This is not different than what's there now. And then we've cut and pasted this section. We saw where it was removed before from the RCN district, and now it is pasted here into the sign district. And it's for hotels, government buildings, churches, laundromats, such and such in the RCN district. So each of those was its own requirements in RCN, and now it's just a section here in the sign ordinance. Off-street parking and loading, we've renumbered it. And we've changed apartments now from 1.5 spaces to just 1 for each apartment, except housing for the elderly, which is actually just 3/10 for each dwelling unit. This is manufactured home parks. First of all, we're just renaming it to the way we have to. And then we've got this language here that was a requirement that was included in the language before, and we just moved it to the parking requirement. Any questions about either the signs section or the parking section? Okay, we're getting to the good stuff now. Section 21, all of this stuff gets deleted because we've moved it to somewhere else in the ordinance. So that's all the mobile home park language. Section 22, we're modifying this now. Foundation requirements, this actually came up today, which is a good thing. We need to make this change. We say right now residential structures are constructed or placed on either a concrete block or treated wood foundation with concrete footings. Well, it doesn't have to be concrete block. Of course, it can be poured concrete or some other version of concrete. Plenty of those exist. So we're just getting rid of block. Question there? All right, section 23, we're deleting this language out of the general regulations where it was, because we've already seen where it's moving to. Section 24, same thing. This is manufactured housing regulations. Actually, most of these are just being deleted. Section 25, we just renumbered junk vehicles. We're also renaming this to make sure it's referring to the only zoning, residential zoning that's there. Section 26 is just renumbering, and then we're also changing the reference again to R2 is going away. Section 27, general requirements for motels and hotels. This is a straight cut and paste. So here is the cut. We already saw the paste. And we are through the language of what's being changed. This is now the how things are being changed section of the ordinance. So I think we can just go ahead and stop sharing and talk about, are there any questions about what's in there? Good. I knew we could get through that section faster because a lot of it really is just cutting and pasting and not changing. And I think we kind of dealt with the tougher changes in our first session. Anyone want to make some comments about where they're at on this, or do we want to talk a little bit about how you want to proceed with considering it? Well, my suggestion is, if you're ready, that we put this on the agenda for your council meeting next Tuesday as an action item. Action not meaning that you're passing it, but that you're just going to make motions and discuss them and take some kind of action on it. It doesn't have to be the last time you talk about it. If you'd prefer to wait to a follow-up meeting from that, that makes sense too. I think that's something worth having you discuss right now.
I think it's worth talking about. I don't know if people are ready to make suggestions by the next meeting. I think there's a few things that I have in the back of my mind. I think there's a few things that we showed tonight we probably need to define better that we talk about. I think no matter how we do this, once we get to a product that we're happy with as a council, I still would like us to see it offered out to public and show them kind of how Patrick did with us, show them examples, what things might look like. I think we could do a really good display. and let people take a look so that they have a better understanding. Whether it's something that we put into the PUC bills that go out every month to invite people, or whether we send small postcards to all of those that are in the city limits and pay PUC bills. I know we're having a hard time getting people to come to us, and somebody mentioned to me that, why don't you go to them? At first, I thought it was a door-to-door campaign, which obviously at the time of year, it's not what we want to do at all. Probably even in summer, I wouldn't want to do it. But I think there's ways to reach out to our PUC citizens and let them know that there's something that we want them to look at and let us know, and then move forward. But just a thought.
Yeah, I think even if we can't get through it all, I mean, I think if people have certain items that we've talked about in these last two meetings, and somebody has something they want to bring forward to discuss next meeting, I think that's great. I think I'd be willing to, if we took the next couple, we have two meetings before we'd send out the next PUC bill. The November bill goes out the 25th or something.
Yeah, I think that'd be pretty tight for us to develop content and get it stuffed in the November bill if we waited for both meetings.
Okay. Well,
That's not the only way that we can mail things to people. So,
right. I mean, maybe if there are issues that people find, again, especially if we're going to wait for for people to have a chance for feedback, maybe if there are specific things that any of us see that we want to make some motions on next time we do that, and we say we're going to send it as it is, after next meeting, if some things can get put together. You're saying you might be able to do it before if we don't wait till the second meeting in November, Mike?
I think if you had something you were comfortable with next meeting, that we could develop content and get it stuffed in a November bill. Yeah. But if you waited till the second meeting in November, I don't think we'd make that.
Sure. Okay. I mean, that to me, I don't know how everybody else feels about it, but I mean, that seems like we're, still working through it. And this is kind of where we feel like it's good. And again, we have the opportunity, a week from now if there's any of those things that, we needed to try and seek clarity on, we can have time in the meeting to discuss it. And, I guess get it out there, because that still gives us time to talk about it more. Right. And maybe some of the other issues, but it kind of lets us have time to talk about it more at the meetings that we'd have subsequently in November and December, while we wait for whatever that allotted feedback time is we decide we want to give. But that, maybe we can get this thing buttoned up here before the end of the year. If, we say it's a couple weeks of feedback time once the mail goes out with our PUC bill. And maybe we'll have addressed some of those comments that we get back. I think we have addressed some already, but maybe we'll address more, and maybe we'll get feedback in and we'll all agree that that makes sense, and maybe we won't. But I think I'd like to see that happen so that we could move it out for the opportunity for feedback instead of waiting a couple meetings. I mean, I'm just one person. So depending on what everybody else thinks, if they have some things they want to, make some motions on next week, I don't know. It seems like we could keep the kind of the ball rolling a little bit, but still not passing anything and not finalizing it, right? Just getting on to the next step for opinions. That's my take.
I think that sounds really good, Anton. I mean, it seems like it's a pretty good process to move forward and make sure that we have enough time to react and time to make sure that we've fully vetted ideas that people have brought up. So I'm in favor of going with that.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think while it's fresh in our minds, while we've at least had these last two meetings rather than delaying, that we at least start to have the conversation, whether we reach agreement that this is a document that we're ready to go with at our next meeting. I don't know if that'll happen, but at least we can start those conversations, and I think get the issues that we see are important out for discussion.
I can imagine that there might be only a short list of issues that you really want to have kind of publicly vetted, and that a lot of the content that's in there, you don't really feel the need to do more of that conversation about. But maybe there's 5 or 6 issues that are kind of your hot buttons that you want to keep working on and thinking about and getting more feedback on. So it's possible that we find that focus next week, kind of where the work still needs to be done, and try to get that to be what we develop the content to go out to the public with. I mean, we've been out to the public, and we've already got content that describes the ordinance as is that we can use. So I think just kind of figuring out where the sticking points still are is going to be helpful. And along those lines, I mean, obviously Tim's got some ideas about things he's going to propose. If folks have ideas about motions they want to make or changes they want to propose, I think it would be helpful if you spend a little time with staff here at City Hall talking about that. Just because the ordinance is so long, even crafting what the motion needs to say might be kind of complicated, and making sure that we all understand exactly what you mean when you make a motion. It might be worth us helping spend a little time, just get your motion crafted and understand all the places in the ordinance that would need to be amended, and make sure that that's really clear for people when the meeting comes around, if that makes sense.
Mike, do you want us to come in and talk to you about those things? Would you prefer that we, type it in an email to you to try to make it clear and then discuss what's the easiest way to do that, do you think?
I think we can do it however works for you. So if you want to do phone conversations, or if you want to come sit down with us, or if you want to write some stuff down, whichever is your preferred method to start the conversation, we can work with.
Okay.
I kind of miss the orange carpet at City Hall. I'm not going to lie to you.
It's still there.
It will be for a while.
I almost emptied your mailbox last week, Anton. I had to stop in for something. I went to grab my mail and I grabbed your mail by accident. So feel free to get what's in your box.
I'll just change the labels the next time you'll empty mine.
Well, are we there? Are we ready? We'll have this conversation next week.
Mike, I was just going to add, if it really is just a handful of issues that people are wondering about, I mean, we have had success with using things like SurveyMonkey, where you let everybody know that there's an online survey and they can, express their support or concerns about things that are being looked at. And that can get a lot of input if that seems helpful.
We've been talking a lot in the office, since the last council meeting where this was on the agenda, about methods to try and do more public input. I super sympathize with the folks that say, why don't you come to us? Because that's the strategy that we've wanted to implement for the past 5 years, is find the places where people congregate and go talk to them there. And that obviously just doesn't happen right now. So it's a real challenge. And there's a lot of online congregating where it's still pretty easy for us to get to large groups of people. But for those folks that don't do that, it's a challenge. And so we've got some other ideas that I think once you've kind of framed for us what the issues are that still need to be discussed publicly about this, we'll have a better, we'll be more able to come up with some strategies to talk to you about how to do that. And so I think we'll be ready to at least preliminarily talk about that next week if it's time, and if you're ready, and if not, then, the meeting after that. Well, thanks everybody for digging in deep on this for almost 4 hours now of in-depth word-by-word conversation about this ordinance. It's obviously big and dry, and there's a lot of things happening just pieces moving around that have clearly caused some confusion in the public. So I'm glad that you've been willing to kind of sort that out yourselves and be part of the solution to help people understand what this all means. And we're going to take advantage of that in the future now that you're all studied up. So
Thanks to you and Patrick and Kim for spending the extra time with us. It's an extra 4 hours away from your families, so we appreciate you guys too.
And poor Jeff. Jeff's like, what's going on with these people? Taking forever.
Zoning's never easy.
And that's why you love it.
That's why I love it.
Thanks, everybody.
all right, well, let's part ways. Good night, all.
Good night.
Right.
Good night.